If you've ever interacted with any LGBTQ content on Instagram or TikTok, you've likely come across a video like one of these.
I don't know what the hell you want from me. Here comes the hurricane, bitch. Here comes the hurricane, bitch.
I think that a lot of young people have noticed this kind of doublespeak from older generations. I know I definitely have. In fact, about a year ago, I got the idea for this video from a Duran Duran album cover. I was listening to New Moon on Monday on my phone after I'd heard it on the radio. Yes, the actual radio. My dad is a construction worker. When I noticed the album cover, on the front of Duran Duran's Seven and the Ragged Tiger were 5 pretty men, some wearing makeup. I couldn't help but think, how gay? Not derogatorily. I mean that in the sense that these men visually looked far more feminine than the frequently lauded, by older homophobes, traditionally masculine men from the 80s. Think Arnold Schwarzenegger, who brought bodybuilding to the mainstream, or Sylvester Stallone, who was a protagonist for classics like Rocky and Rambo. While anti-LGBTQ people claim that back in their day, men were overwhelmingly more masculine than they are today, in terms of 80s music pop culture, this couldn't be farther from the truth. Most of the popular music from the 80s was written and performed by queer people, or by men who adorned queer aesthetics. It was camp. Of course, a man can dress however he likes. It doesn't indicate whether or not he likes other men. But in a homophobic world, dressing feminine as a man can lead to people calling you a name once reserved for cigarettes. When you think of the 80s, you think of Motley Crue and their glam metal aesthetics, Madonna and her iconic gay pop, or of queer musicians like David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, and George Michael. Kelly Murphy wrote for Far Out magazine. A lot of it is fun, exciting, and nostalgic, but it also aligns perfectly with queer culture and identities. Many of the biggest stars of the time, like Wham, Elton John, The Cure, and Erasure, threaded queerness in some form into their music, whether they identified as LGBTQ+ or not. At the same time, you remember an era of intense conservatism, which included the lie of trickle-down economics, the racist war on drugs and crime, and the prevalent homophobia that increased even more during the AIDS crisis. After all, music was something to be enjoyed and celebrated, but homosexuality remained taboo. As the art form moved forward, the government moved backwards. It seems like a paradox, the fact that most of the popular musicians during this time were gay themselves or dressed in a way that would get them called gay. How could these two ideas exist within the same time period? That's what I'm going to be exploring today. You may be coming to certain conclusions already, but I can assure you that the space between 80s pop culture and 80s conservatism is both smaller and larger than you may think. As the lefties say, Reagan ruined everything, but the one thing he couldn't was music.
In the House of Lords, a vote is taking place now.
Protesting about rights for lesbian and gay people.
I think you've talked on the radio before about sexuality.
A mystery disease known as the gay plague has become an epidemic unprecedented in the history of American medicine.
She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers.
In order to adequately cover this topic, I have to go back in time and examine the political landscape of the 80s. Of course, as most of us know, Reaganomics and Thatcherism, both mostly based on neoliberalism, were prominent in the West, with the 1980 election and 1984 re-election of US President Ronald Reagan, and the 11-year reign of UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, which started in 1979. During Cold War times, the West in general, but America specifically, was still being sold anti-communist and anti-leftist propaganda, all while consumerism, extreme conservatism, and notably, the class divide was worsening. A prevailing anti-leftist sentiment is important to note, as it was heightened with the failures of the USSR that were used as leverage against anything vaguely resembling even the not-so-radical democratic socialism. What's this? Somebody wants to give you free healthcare? Let you earn enough to live? Advocate for marginalized groups? Get rid of the broken justice system? Ooh, we can't have that. Before we know it, we'll turn into the USSR, or worse, China. Anti-leftist propaganda was, and still is, the perfect tool to make average working-class Americans hate anything that would improve their lives, like getting rid of a class hierarchy that intentionally divides people into poverty, or ending racist and anti-queer culture wars that blame minorities for all of our problems. Obviously, there are many reasons as to why Reagan won, but taking into consideration what I just said, it's no surprise that Reagan's numerous lies, including the ones told about the economy, led to his overwhelming win in 1980, with only 4 states handing their electoral votes to the Democratic candidate, Jimmy Carter, though the popular vote was much less of a landslide than the overwhelming red electoral map. with Reagan winning only about half of the popular vote. In 1984, he was re-elected with 2/3 of the popular vote, with only one single state turning blue on the Electoral College map. Well, you tried, Minnesota. Too bad participation trophies mean nothing in politics. Just ask Hillary Clinton. It's not an exaggeration to say that the policies that Reagan enacted have followed America for decades since his presidency, with the effects only becoming worse as the years have gone on, as both Democratic and Republican cabinets have kept up with his reign of neoliberalism. Donald Trump is only the most recent example, literally taking a few pages out of Reagan's playbook, even down to his 2025 Mandate for Leadership, drafted by the Heritage Foundation. An exact repeat of what happened with Reagan. Although the foundation does draft a mandate for every presidency, Trump's is eerily similar to Reagan's. Unlike any president before him, and as it was with Reagan, will have dangerous trickle-down effects decades down the line. It's well known that Reagan's economic policies helped to create the extreme wealth, income, and wage inequality that we face today. For instance, Reagan cut the top tax rate from 70% to 50% in 1981, and from 50% to 28% in 1986, the lowest since 1931. It has remained around that percentage since then. Reagan's lie of trickle-down economics swayed enough working-class Americans to elect him twice. But as the years have gone on, it's obvious that nothing has trickled down. Capitalism requires a hierarchy that allows the ruling class to hoard wealth, leading to a gap, whether big or small, between the ruling and the working class. Nothing is ever going to trickle down, except for the piss of Amazon slave workers. The rich grow richer, while the rest grow poor. There is no equality under capitalism. Reagan also helped to propagate the idea of the welfare queen, which has led to a hate and stigma of state-sponsored social services that, to this day, has not left the American public consensus. Linda Taylor was a woman behind Reagan's infamous speech about the welfare queen. While she did defraud the federal government, it wasn't as much as Reagan made it out to be. Not only that, but actual fraud in governmental social programs is incredibly rare, and that can be proven by actual government data. In reality, most people are just trying to get by. But because we live in a system that promotes individual success and failure, people receiving basic support are made out to be leeches and losers. It was easy to use lies about widespread abuses in the system as a scapegoat to cut social spending. To people who were opposed to welfare, Taylor's colorful transgressions were evidence of just how little oversight there was in the program and how easily it could be abused. In reality, Taylor stole her money from a host of government services and defrauded private individuals too. Josh Levin wrote an extensive piece in Slate on Taylor's life and her many crimes, many of which are much, much worse than taking a mere $40,000 from the federal government. He writes, Linda Taylor showed that it was possible for a dedicated criminal to steal a healthy chunk of welfare money. Her case did not prove that, as a group, public aid recipients were fur-laden thieves bleeding the American economy dry. Not only did the stereotype of the welfare queen demonize poor people in general, but it was also a racist dog whistle, used to point fingers at those criminal black people. In this case, black women with dozens of fatherless kids leeching off of our tax dollars. Like I said, the vast majority of people on Medicaid, SNAP, and so on are not defrauding the government. Moreover, most of the recipients are white. As the political scientist M. Whitesell argues in her book, Living Off of the Government, much of U.S. social policy in the post-Reagan era is a direct reaction to the welfare queen's perceived moral defects. The public identity of the welfare queen, the poor, single African-American woman whose poverty was caused by her own laziness and promiscuity, is still the driving force in creating welfare policy, she writes. The results, she argues, are public policies that calcify racial and gender stereotypes of people in poverty while failing to provide the help they actually need. If Reagan could create a hatred for poor people, especially poor black people, then he could further his party's goal to increase incarceration. Cue the war on drugs. While the war on drugs was initially created by Richard Nixon, Reagan expanded it greatly, largely due to crack hitting the streets. Again, all this ties back to using minorities and the poor as scapegoats in order to advance pro-rich policies. Who is the most incarcerated in America? Black people, poor people, other disadvantaged groups. Who benefits the most from more incarceration? Wealthy people, corporations, and the white majority. And who do politicians represent? Well, I think that you can put two and two together. Reagan said in a 1986 address to the nation about the war on drugs, "From the beginning of our administration, we've taken strong steps to do something about this horror. Tonight, I can report to you that we've made much progress. 37 federal agencies are working together in vigorous national effort. And by next year, our spending for drug law enforcement will have more than tripled from its 1981 levels. My generation will remember how America swung into action when we were attacked in World War II. The war was not just fought by the fellows flying the planes or driving the tanks. It was fought at home by a mobilized nation, men and women alike, building planes and ships, clothing sailors and soldiers, feeding Marines and airmen. And it was fought by children planting victory gardens and collecting cans. Well, now we're in another war for our freedom, and it's time for all of us to pull together again. Years down the line, and I think it's obvious that increased criminalization doesn't solve rampant drug abuse. It only leads to more slaves for prison labor, of whom mostly become repeat offenders, and of whom are mostly Black and Hispanic. 32% of the US population is represented by African Americans and Hispanics, compared to 56% of the US incarcerated population being represented by African Americans and Hispanics. Britannica reported on the war on drugs. A notable feature of mandatory minimums was a massive gap between the amounts of crack and powder cocaine that resulted in the same minimum sentence. Possession of 5 grams of crack led to an automatic 5-year sentence, while it took the possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine to trigger that sentence. Since approximately 80% of crack users were African American, mandatory minimums led to an unequal increase of incarceration rates for nonviolent Black drug offenders. Moreover, there are more white drug users than Black. Yet again, Black people are persecuted more, with the NAACP reporting that in 2015, 5% of illicit drug users are African American. Yet African Americans represent 29% of those arrested and 33% of those incarcerated for drug offenses. Reagan's crime war worked, along with the assistance of his predecessor Nixon, the Sentencing Project reported in 2022. In 1972, the imprisonment rate was 93 per 100,000 people. The prison expansion that commenced in 1973 reached its peak in 2009, achieving a 7-fold increase over the intervening years. Between 1985 and 1995 alone, the total prison population grew an average of 8% annually. The US has the 3rd highest prison population in the world, just following Cuba and Rwanda. If Louisiana was a country, it would have the 2nd highest incarceration rate in the world, following second only to El Salvador. Despite making up only 5% of the global population, the US has 20% of the world's prison population. Reagan, Thatcher, and the intense rise of neoliberalism and conservatism in the West led us to a revolution in music, a response to the bullshit. While to us now, it may seem like subversive or overtly queer music wasn't as heavily targeted back then, it and many other genres of music were major targets of the culture of the time. We have to go back to the 70s to get an understanding of how different kinds of queer, Black, and other non-conformative music was targeted by American nationalists. Disco was the popular music of the 1970s, and its popularity helped to develop later and modern pop sounds as well as other genres like house music. But not everyone liked disco. While some people surely hated the genre because they felt it was overplayed, too mainstream, or simply because it wasn't their cup of tea, a large portion of disco haters, whether consciously or not, hated it because disco was queer, Black, Latin, different. Music journalist Danielle Smith wrote in her book Shine Bright, a part biography and autobiography about Black women in pop. Disco was denigrated by most of the white rock community, and by many straight white males who wanted their Kiss and Blue Oyster Cult and Clapton. Disco music was Black music, basically, music historian John Manuel Andriette said in 2017. It was mostly recorded by Black artists until the mid to late 1970s, when white artists realized how popular the music had become. The anti-disco movement reached a head in 1979, when Disco Demolition Night took place. On July 12th, at Comiskey Park, home to the White Sox, a band led by radio DJ Steve Dahl was going to be performing. Dahl had worked with the White Sox to promote the event, which would take place in between games. If you showed up with a disco album, you could get in for little less than $1. Before the second game, the stadium over capacity, Dahl blew up a dumpster filled with records in the middle of the field, with thousands of people then rushing the field in a riot. A Black man who attended the event, having little idea of what it was going to entail, told The Guardian, "People weren't just turning up with disco records, but anything made by a Black artist. I said to my boss, hey, a lot of these records they're bringing in aren't disco, they're R&B, they're funk. Should I make them go home and get a real disco record?" Steve Dahl denies that the event was anti-Black or anti-gay. The Guardian quoted his 2016 book Disco Demolition, The Night That Disco Died. "I'm worn out from defending myself as a racist homophobe. We were just kids pissing on a musical genre." Moreover, he was defending the Chicago rock and roll lifestyle from an unwanted musical invasion. Yet, as BBC reported, at the time he derided disco as effeminate and described rock and roll as threatened as a species. Also included in that article was a quote from a member of the disco group Chic, wherein they said, "It felt to us like a Nazi book burning." For many disco haters, the rise of the genre symbolized a culture war between the white and non-white, between the queer and straight, between American values and everything that isn't. Well-known music critic Dave Marsh wrote following Disco Demolition Night, The anti-disco movement is simply another programming device. White males 18 to 34 are the most likely to see disco as a product of homosexuals, blacks, and Latins, and therefore they're most likely to respond to appeals to wipe out such threats to their security. In times when straight pop music is boring or ineffectual, minority taste, rock, soul, disco, prosper because the mass audience drifts away. Disco was the first choice to fill the resulting vacuum. That's why so many radio stations rushed to change their formats, why certain rock acts, the Kinks, the Beach Boys, tried to make disco crossover music. But disco didn't do the job. For rock acts and record companies, the sign was sluggish sales. For radio stations, disco pulled in an audience that was older, younger, more female, or less affluent than desired. Disco didn't die, as its influence on later music cannot be understated. But after this night, it began a slow decline. What would replace it? It certainly wasn't the only non-conformative music that was targeted in the 70s and 80s, lest we forget about the great Satanic Panic of the 80s, led on by the extreme conservatism of the time. The Canadian book, Michelle Remembers, helped to spawn an era of anti-everything, with people targeting anything from heavy metal to sex to Dungeons and Dragons and even children's cartoons for their supposed subliminal messaging that spread the word of the devil. Michelle Remembers, co-written by psychiatrist and patient, of whom would later marry, tells the story of Michelle Smith, who was apparently given away at age 5 to a satanic cult by her mother, where she was then tortured for 14 months. A 2023 documentary titled Satan Wants You is considered to be formative in unveiling how this book captured the moral panic of the Western audience of the time. Satan Wants You tells the sad story of Michelle Smith, a troubled woman who suffered from depression. After a miscarriage, she got a psychiatrist who was also a lay Catholic leader. The psychiatrist decided that his patient's rambling, confused recollections were in fact repressed memories of tribal rituals similar to those he witnessed as an African missionary. Together they documented her memories, twisting them in the process, and coming to the conclusion that Michelle's mother had willingly offered her daughter to a satanic cult for its practices. Keep in mind, there were multiple cult massacres at the time. Combined with the increase of various pagan influences in the West and an extreme shift to an even more conservative country, ignorant Americans were primed for the Satanic Panic. With the increase of satanic imagery in popular culture, such as in horror movies like The Exorcist, or within rock and metal, like the rise of the revolutionary metal band Black Sabbath, Americans felt like the devil was everywhere. The early 1980s introduced a crime-stopping innovation that inadvertently contributed to the panic. Dairy companies began putting the images of missing or kidnapped children on the sides of milk cartoons, along with phone numbers to send tips to authorities. The project did lead to many cases being closed, but it also gave the broader public the impression that there was a sudden epidemic in child kidnappings. The panic was so widespread in part because it was based on the eternal impulse to protect the young, the innocent, and the vulnerable. In 1985, after 2 men attempted suicide with one succeeding, their parents blamed the band Judas Priest, alleging that the band included satanic subliminal messaging in their songs that told people to kill themselves. It went to court, where the judge thankfully ruled in favor of the band. Speaking of Rolling Stone in 2015, lead singer Rob Halford expressed both relief and disappointment in the tragic circumstances. Had the judge found in favor about these so-called subliminal messages having the power to physically manifest themselves and make people do something, the ramifications of that would have been extraordinary, he said. How do you prove to somebody that there are not subliminal messages on your record when you can't hear them in the first place? Rock, but mostly heavy metal music, was one of the biggest targets of the panic. To this day, despite bands like Black Sabbath, Korn, System of a Down, Slipknot, and others' contributions to the genre and to music as a whole, there is still a stigma with heavy metal and the aesthetics associated with it. It's a moralizing of music that uses the false notion, propped up by bogus pseudoscience and moral panic, that the kind of music you listen to will dictate how you behave. Like how people have, for years, tried to make the increase in violent video games the reason for why people commit mass shootings. Music with satanic or non-conformist undertones will make people act out, possibly in violent ways. It just makes them so angry they have to kill someone. My Gen X mother, despite being a huge Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath fan, was poisoned by the still thriving satanic panic that rose in her teenage years. Every time I turn on metal or autistically rant about the musical genius of Slipknot, she shakes it off and just calls it satanic and evil. Oh, the devil has rooted himself in many, but not in me. As it was with society at the time and now, a societal pushback against evil and sinful music only makes people want to engage with it more. I already listen to Slipknot a lot. 33 hours in October. But I turn it on more often when my mom's around because I know that it annoys her. This period of moral outrage and fear was egged on by the diabolical propaganda of Tipper Gore's histrionic Parents Music Resource Center, PMRC, and their infamous Filthy 15 list, a document that pilloried 15 seemingly arbitrarily chosen songs for their supposed sexual, pro-drug, or occult themes. Gore and her fellow Washington wives sought to save the children from raunch and sleaze by instituting a mandatory rating system. As their crusade intensified, rock music itself came under fire, so much that Frank Zappa, John Denver and Twisted Sister's Dee Snider ended up defending their faith in front of a Senate committee. Among that list were the usual suspects: AC/DC, Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Twisted Sister, and Motley Crue. But also, notably, more queer-presenting and camp pop artists like Prince and Madonna, both of which I will discuss later. The PMRC's outrage was so powerful that, like the previous quote read, it resulted in Senate hearings, with artists like Twisted Sister's Dee Snider and Frank Zappa testifying, leading to the parental advisory stamps we now see on album covers. While the panic may be laughed off by some, it did have real impacts, not only on music and pop culture, but also on real people's lives. Multiple people were wrongly convicted as child sex predators, homicidal maniacs, and abusers, all due to the panic. For almost all of these cases, the victims testified about outlandish satanic rituals with little to no evidence except conspiratorial theories to back it all up. As of April 2023, some of these people were still being exonerated in Texas. It's no surprise that the satanic panic and politics of the 80s also helped to create a moral panic about rap music in general, but gangster rap specifically, as gangster rap entered the sphere in the 80s with NWA, Public Enemy, Run DMC, among others, becoming widely popularized in the 90s. An LA Times article from 1989 read, "It's a noisy and crude attack on mainstream sensibilities that has even liberal-minded adults who were raised on the rebellious outlaw beat of Little Richard and the Rolling Stones asking themselves, what happened to real music?" While these adults shudder at the sound of rap, however, the music is the pulse of a far wider urban hip-hop phenomenon, a glorious multi-layered celebration of spontaneous, street-ignited artistry that also includes breakdancing, graffiti, and video. Its energy and flash and style have moved into advertising, fashion, and of course, the pop music mainstream. Though much of the music was homophobic and misogynistic, the idea that rap was ruining the culture and causing people to act violently was overblown and racist. Music that had sexual themes was also under attack. Madonna's 1984 Like a Virgin and its title song and music video sparked backlash for its sexual themes. Of course, the name Madonna is a reference to the Virgin Mary and her Immaculate Conception. In the music video, Madonna, the singer, adorns a bride dress, mocking conservative ideals of womanhood. Nathan Smith wrote for Out magazine. It was in 1984 that Madonna was pushing the envelope around the intersection of women and religion, and actively mocking the cultural norms and ideologies around women and virginity. Using symbols such as the white wedding dress, rosary beads, and a cross covering her heart, Madonna articulated a backlash against these antiquated beliefs around women. In a decade plagued by mass hysteria because of the HIV/AIDS crisis and the way sex, for both heterosexual and homosexual couples, was characterized by illness, viral exchanges, and the threat of contamination, Madonna's song moved away from discussing the seemingly abject nature of sex in an epoch so preoccupied by the dangers of sex and illness. The singer's other classic and extremely controversial song, Like a Prayer, barely made it on MTV, the home of music videos at the time. Featuring a story about systemic racism, an on-screen interracial couple, and many burning crosses, the music video was blacklisted by most TV stations. The Catholic Church called for a boycott, with even the Pope making a statement against it. The deal that Pepsi had made with her to promote her new album and tour cycle was quickly canceled. Nexus Radio reported, drawing on her experiences of growing up Catholic, she worked with producers Stephen Bray and Patrick Leonard to write a song that expressed her complicated feelings towards God. As she put it, the song was ultimately about a girl so in love with God that it is as though he was the only male figure in her life. The singer would be followed by controversy for decades, of course for her celebrity ignorance, but notably because of a similar stunt on her 2007's Confession World Tour, wherein during her performance of the song Live to Tell, she is crucified on a cross. At the time, NBC removed this part from her primetime tour special. Actually, my mom owns the Confessions Tour DVD, and I vividly remember watching this performance on the TV when I was 5. Maybe Madonna subliminally made me hate organized Christianity. Or maybe that was the 4 years of CCD. Dave Marsh, in his previously quoted Rolling Stone article, said, "In the 70s, a new kind of rock band developed that managed to sell its members as role models to the younger rock audience. But Grand Funk is gone, Alice Cooper's career is in limbo, Aerosmith is on the wane, and I Was Made for Loving You, however effective its disco beat, must have eroded Kiss's credibility with its hardcore fans. Such acts were meant to be outgrown, and they can't convert the next generation. There's nothing more obnoxious than your older brother's favorite band, except maybe your younger brother's favorite band. But there's nothing remotely new about what these bands are doing. Once more, the new waves filling a market void, not instigating a revolution in pop music taste. The people who might do that, The Clash, to cite an extreme example, are still largely unheard by the pop audience. Yet, there was a revolution in pop music. The 80s, partially influenced by the queer and black aesthetics of disco. James Factora and Juan Velasquez said in Them magazine, "New wave, the quintessential genre of the 1980s, wouldn't have been possible without queer creativity." Madonna, herself a queer woman, helped to start a wave of pop stars seeking controversy to sell their music, be that pissing off various religions or, well, mostly just pissing off religious people actually. Her sexualized music, though not overtly queer, was pushing boundaries in the Christian conservative culture. But there were plenty more artists pushing boundaries, big and small. Like I stated earlier, Most of the music and aesthetics of the time that we look back on as being queer were not necessarily queer in the literal definition, but were queer in the sense that they were outside of the conservative political norms. Examples of this are bands like Motley Crue or Guns N' Roses. Motley Crue's 1983's Shout at the Devil cover features each band member in full glam, wearing outfits very Rocky Horror Picture Show-esque. An aesthetic now called glam metal or hair metal took over the 80s, with most rock and metal bands of the time adorning this look. Glam or hair metal was a subgenre of metal which featured more flamboyant camp looks, including the aforementioned bands, but also bands like Kiss and Poison. The lead singer of Guns N' Roses, Axl Rose, despite having an incredibly homophobic and racist history, has, for years, had rumors speculating that he is a closeted gay man. Rose said in a 1989 Rolling Stone interview, "I'm pro-heterosexual. I can't get enough of women, and I don't see the same thing that other men can see in men. I'm not into gay or bisexual experiences. But that's hypocritical of me, because I'd rather see two women together than just about anything else. That happens to be my personal favorite thing. No, I've never had beaten up someone who is gay. The most I do is like, on the way to the Troubadour in Boys Town on Santa Monica Boulevard, I'll yell out the window, 'Why don't you guys like?' Because I'm confused. I don't understand it. Anti-homosexual? I'm not against them doing what they want to do as long as it's not hurting anybody else and not forcing it upon me. I don't need them in my face or, pardon the pun, up my ass about it." Lyrics in the racist and homophobic song 1 in a Million describe gay men as that spread disease, leading to the band being pulled from a 1988 AIDS benefit in New York City that they were supposed to perform at. Ironically enough, Rose says later in the 1989 interview that he too is afraid of contracting AIDS. The lead singer of Kiss, Paul Stanley, despite dressing up in glam for his entire career, even went on a Twitter rant in 2023 about transgender children, calling them a sad and dangerous fad. Prince, despite being a straight man, was also non-conforming in his appearance and performances, though unlike the extreme heterosexuality of the aforementioned bands, Prince was much more exploratory with his gender and sexual expression, which led to much speculation that the other band members did not have to face. I don't bring up Prince to say that he is any way similar to these bands' performances or members, as Kiss's members are not usually seen as queer icons, but like Kiss, Prince's viewpoints did heavily contradict with his presentation. Later in his life, Prince became a Jehovah's Witness, allegedly espousing beliefs against gay marriage. Prince's music very obviously had a lot of religious symbolism throughout, as he was raised a Seventh-day Adventist before converting. But you can have faith without being anti-LGBTQ. To many queer fans of Prince, his alleged comments were a strange revelation. Not only was Prince non-conformative in the way he presented, but his lyrics were also very queer. Chelsea Reynolds, a gender and sexuality scholar, wrote in Vox after his death, arguing against the strict categorization of the fluid icon Prince. Mainstream thought posits, if a man dresses like a woman, doesn't that make him queer? If a man has sex with other men, doesn't that make him gay? Not necessarily. Prince tried to help us understand the differences between identity, how we think of ourselves, behavior, what we do, and perception, how others think of us. Prince dismantled and queried what contemporary culture has tried to bracket. Must queer and gender fluid people cast shade on one of the many icons who paved the way for sexual expression? An Atlantic headline sums up the controversy pretty well. Prince will always be a gay icon, whether he wanted to be or not. Like Motley Crue, Kiss, and so on, Axl Rose and Guns N' Roses adorned camp aesthetics while being painfully heterosexual. Some glam metal bands of the time were even extremely anti-LGBTQ. Motley Crue's Girls, Girls, Girls is one of the most heterosexual songs to come out of the 80s. But it's not the only one. A lot of the queer looks from straight bands of the time were forgiven by listeners because they were so straight. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Tommy Lee was a straight man, despite his fashion choices. The 80s was a time of glamour and excess. These men's performances were just that, a performance, separate from their identity. And while they may be seen as camp now, they weren't at the time. Yet many artists of the time would not be let off so easily by the conservative culture. Their artistry was their identity. David Carroll wrote in the Irish Research Council, "As a gay teenager in 1980s Ireland, it seemed impossible to find positive messaging or representations in relation to homosexuality. For me, pop music provided one of the few access points to a world beyond the gray, heteronormative confines of Irish society. Instead, pop music abundantly challenged the prevailing gender and sexuality-related norms, and indeed, seemed to positively revel in doing so. For those who weren't alive at the time, it may seem like queer artists like George Michael, Elton John, David Bowie, and Freddie Mercury were paradoxically able to coexist with a neoliberal conservative Western world. And while we can look back at this queer music with love, it was far from celebrated at the time. It was a pointed response to not only the anti-LGBTQ culture, but also the oppositional, traditional, and preppy conservative style of the time. From the aesthetics of the cultural phenomenon of the gender bender to the advent of the first unapologetic, unretractable gay identification of pop stars such as Jimmy Somerville, pop had never been so sexually transgressive. The most important thing to discuss before delving into these artists is the elephant in the room: the AIDS crisis. You see, the 80s wasn't just known for its extreme economic or judicial conservatism. Socially, as we saw with the war against poor and black people, communists and leftists, the 80s would also be known for its trademark homophobia. Even before the markings of AIDS, anti-LGBTQ sentiment was pervasive in American culture. Though some states decriminalized it, sodomy laws were not nationally struck down until the Supreme Court case Lawrence versus Texas in 2003. LGBTQ people were rarely positively represented in the media, and violence and discrimination was extremely common for members of the community. Anti-discrimination laws for housing, jobs, and so on did not exist. Eric Jimenez Lindmeyer wrote in the Huffington Post on his experience of being closeted in the 80s. Being gay in the 80s meant being isolated from an identity. There was no discussion of homosexuality in school. What I observed was that no men ever hugged, or held hands, or kissed on TV. The censors would never have allowed that. Even if they had, the individual stations and their viewers would have revolted. Worse yet, in the 80s, no one talked about actually being gay. Of course, there were rumors about others, whispers here and there about a few of my classmates. One was picked on relentlessly for his gay-sounding voice, lack of sports abilities, and unwillingness to stand up to his bullies. Dressing camp, gaudy, or glamorous, while sometimes being a part of the counterculture of the time, wasn't going to get you bullied for being gay, which is starkly different from today's culture. But acting gay would. My mother tells me that there was no homophobia because no one talked about it. But there was homophobia, in part because no one talked about it. Being closeted and deathly afraid of being outed was the experience of many queer people of the time. The culture had a sort of don't ask, don't tell vibe. We won't assume Freddie Mercury is gay because he's cool and makes good music. As long as he doesn't talk about it, then we don't care what he does in his private life. On the other hand, due to the homophobia at the time, queer artists and artists with queer aesthetics were made fun of by some people, though the more overwhelming response was a celebratory ignorance, intentional or not. Anti-LGBTQ sentiment and policy was already bad, but when AIDS hit, the already prominent discrimination only increased. In 1981, AIDS, initially called gay-related immunodeficiency disease, began to spread in the United States. As of August 1981, of the 108 cases reported to date, 107 are male, 94% of those whose sexual orientation is known are gay/bisexual, and 40% of all patients have already died. At the beginning of 1982, Gay Men's Health Crisis was founded at NYC as a hotline for queer men. GMHC went on to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for the cause, and now offers HIV/AIDS-related healthcare. In September of the same year, Representative Philip Burton and Representative Ted Wise joined together to introduce the first legislation to allocate funding for AIDS research. The resolution dies in committee. Congress will not approve the first dedicated funding for AIDS research and treatment until July 1983. By 1985, a year after the virus AIDS is discovered, over 15,000 people have contracted it, 12,000 of them dead. After his friend and colleague actor Rock Hudson is diagnosed with AIDS, President Ronald Reagan, for the first time in 4 years, addresses the crisis during a news conference. He won't make his first public speech dedicated to AIDS until 1987. The same year, the first drug to treat the disease was finally approved by the FDA. A New York Times article published after his first public comment reported that Mr. Reagan said that he had been supporting research into AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, for the last 4 years, and that the effort was a top priority for the administration. The CDC reported in 1985 that Black and Latino people were more likely to be affected by the disease, a figure still true today as both groups disproportionately represent new AIDS cases, largely due to higher poverty rates that lead to less access to preventative care and testing. In Reagan's first public address on AIDS, he said, "What our citizens must know is this. America faces a disease that is fatal and spreading, and this calls for urgency, not panic. It calls for compassion, not blame. It calls for understanding, not ignorance. It's also important that America not reject those who have the disease, but care for them with dignity and kindness. Final judgment is up to God. Our part is to ease the suffering and find a cure. This is a battle against disease, not against our fellow Americans. We mustn't allow those with AIDS virus to suffer discrimination. We must firmly oppose discrimination against those who have AIDS. We must prevent the persecution through ignorance or malice of our fellow citizens." By the time Reagan addressed the lies about AIDS, though, the situation was already out of hand. Despite everyone being susceptible to it, with drug users and people with certain blood illnesses being at a higher risk for transmission, AIDS was, and still is to some extent, known as the gay disease. Although the disease is only contractable through blood and sexual intercourse, due to the government's incredibly slow response, ignorance and lies about the disease were able to spread like wildfire. People thought that just touching someone who was gay would give you AIDS. By the end of the decade, over 100,000 people had contracted AIDS. Many gay men said that at the time, it was just expected that you'd get AIDS and likely die. Nigel Lewis, a gay man alive during the outbreak in the UK, told the BBC. It was called this gay plague, but no one knew how it was spreading. Was it contagious? Everyone in the gay community was terrified, and all of a sudden everyone withdrew. I can remember how all the pubs went quiet and emptied, and some people avoided you due to ignorance. You could see they were embarrassed to talk to you. It was a very unkind time. That was the other thing. The shame that the men who had it. You didn't even dare tell anyone you were gay, let alone your HIV status. It was a really worrying time. Nigel was also beaten up in a club around this time in a hate crime. At this time in the UK, under Margaret Thatcher, Parliament had approved a law called Clause 28, a 1988 regulation which stopped schools and councils, including fucking garbage collectors, from promoting the teaching of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Like Don't Say Gay laws for Florida schools, which have since been replicated by various states. Laws like this mean that queer kids have no education about themselves, that queer teachers are targeted, and that LGBTQ people as a whole are even more stigmatized and forced to hide. A contestant from RuPaul's Drag Race UK told the BBC that going to school queer at the time included kids in the playground pushing and shoving and calling you a throwing their drinks on you. Because of Section 28, it meant that a lot of teachers felt like they couldn't step in. I'm sure most of you know this by now, but the stigma around AIDS was so bad that Princess Diana simply shaking the hand of an infected person was seen as a radical act. Yet, among the intense homophobia and a crisis that would go on to kill tens of thousands of people, there was music. The San Francisco Men's Chorus described the pop music of the 80s as a rallying cry and a form of solace for those affected by the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. The legacy of this era is not confined to the past, but resonates profoundly in the present. While plenty of male artists were performing in what was essentially drag and making countercultural music like heavy metal, the real lasting legacies of the queer 80s were queer artists themselves, along with black and brown artists who developed disco and subsequent pop sounds of the 80s. Two black queer artists, Sylvester with hits mostly from the 70s, and Jermaine Stewart with hits like We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off, did something that many queer artists at the time did not: be openly gay. In a 1986 interview with Joan Rivers, after having performed at one of the first AIDS benefits in the US, Sylvester showed his wedding ring to the audience, sharing his marriage to his husband Rick. Open declarations of love or marriage between two men are rare today, but in the 80s, ruled as it was by AIDS, hysteria, and homophobia, it was unthinkable. And yet, Sylvester lived his life openly and without shame, regardless of the consequences. He died that way as well. Sylvester died 3 months after sharing his status with the world from complications related to the virus. Before he did so, he bequeathed future royalties from his music to AIDS charities. The current beneficiaries are AIDS Emergency Fund and Project Open Hand. Jermaine had also openly stated that he was a gay man, and like Sylvester, had also died after contracting AIDS, specifically from liver cancer that was related to the disease. Like many black gay men at the time, the Stewarts were not recognized for their contributions to the culture, and because of AIDS, they died without as much support as they needed. Though today, as we do with other artists of the time, we value their contributions to queer music more than people did back then, the Stewarts are still not mentioned enough in these conversations. Most of the other queer icons of the time were very quiet about their gender and sexuality due to the social stigma around being queer. David Bowie, while initially publicly declaring himself as gay and then bisexual in the late 70s, walked back on his identity in the early 80s, with fans speculated that he did so due to not wanting to ruin his reputation and career, what with the AIDS stigma and intense homophobia at the time. Whether or not Bowie was actually bisexual, it does not negate the impact that Ziggy Stardust's flamboyant androgyny had, or the impact that his queer songs like John I'm Only Dancing and Boys Keep Singing had on the culture at the time and our present day though. On top of that, regardless of what it actually was, he was still one of the few artists of the time that was actually open with their sexuality. Boy George of the UK band Culture Club was another artist who was more open about his sexuality at the time, even citing Bowie as inspiration for his sexual and gender expression. Due to his makeup looks being a part of the new wave culture, some listeners were genuinely shocked when he said, accepting their Grammy for Best New Artist in 1984, "Thank you, America, you've got great taste, style, and you know a good drag queen when you see one." A controversial biopic from 2023 called Boy George and Culture Club even featured an interviewer asking someone with a God hates sign outside of a concert venue whether or not they were going to George's show, in which they responded, "Oh yes, we love Boy George." Like I said, most queer artists from the 80s who we view as gay icons now were closeted during their heyday. What seems obviously queer to us now wasn't always viewed as gay back then. People were reluctant to accept and ignorant to the fact that camp musicians like Elton John, Freddie Mercury, Boy George, and George Michael were gay. They were rock stars. Of course they weren't gay. Some of them were with women at the time too, which helped stave off accusations of homosexuality. Elton John, like Bowie, had publicly declared his bisexuality in a 1976 Rolling Stone issue, saying, "I'd rather fall in love with a woman eventually because I think a woman probably lasts much longer than a man," he said. But I don't really know. I've never talked about this before, but I'm not going to turn off the tape. I haven't met anybody that I would like to settle down with, of either sex. Although John's sexuality was something of an open secret within the rock and roll community, it clearly wasn't the case with the masses. Yet, John wouldn't come out as gay until 1988, in another Rolling Stone issue, though it wasn't widely known he was gay until 1992, the same year he founded the Elton John AIDS Foundation. Like other artists, although he wasn't very open about his sexuality, his music and performances were still fundamental in many queer people's lives at the time. You could be flamboyant like John, yet never discuss your sexuality, since, as I think you've been able to pick up throughout this video, camp aesthetics were accepted as part of the culture of the time, despite the world being incredibly anti-LGBTQ. John's song, Elton's Song, is considered by himself as the first time he wrote from the perspective of a gay man. Kelly Murphy wrote about the song in Far Out magazine. Lyrically, the song begins with a sweet and delicate account of the boy's fixation with the man, as he describes his appearance and his razor blade smile. However, as we go along, the loneliness that the boy feels both in his sexuality and his romanticism becomes clear. "I would give my life for a single night beside you," John sings, depicting the frustration of pining for someone else. All respect and consideration of sexual fluidity aside, the music video to Elton's Song was particularly progressive in the early 1980s, as it overtly depicted a boy pining for another classmate. Granted, this wasn't exactly John's own personal account, but it provided a deeply personal insight into John's own world as he navigated sexuality and constant media scrutiny. John has stated that in the 80s he was battling intense drug addiction. He said in a 2017 benefit for his foundation that his experience in the 80s with the Whites, a famous family whose son had contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion, encouraged him to get clean. He said that he watched many friends die of AIDS in the 80s. Due to his addiction, he says, he wasn't able to advocate enough for the epidemic. I also wouldn't doubt if part of it was the fear of being labeled as a gay artist. Not just a flamboyant performer, but as a One Billboard article put it perfectly. This was the don't ask, don't tell era of pop, when stars scrambled norms of gender and sexuality in a way that bypassed homophobia while hitting a demographic sweet spot that excluded no one. They acted out fantasies on behalf of their audience, but it was unthreatening, in the realm of make-believe rather than the truth of their sexuality, says Martin Aston, author of Breaking Down the Walls of Heartache, How Music Came Out. John told NPR in 2012, "I hadn't gotten my hands dirty with the AIDS epidemic while I was a drug addict and an alcoholic. So how do you get involved? You volunteer and you do things on a grassroots level, and that's how I started. And it was shocking, it was inspiring, and it was very empowering." Elton, in 1985, along with other notable gay artists like George Michael and Freddie Mercury, performed at a Live Aid concert in London's Wembley Stadium, raising money for AIDS, all while living in secret. In the very last Wham interview in No. 1 magazine, when asked about his sexuality, Michael responds, "Everyone else has talked about our sex lives, but we really haven't. George Michael, is he gay?" His saxophonist says, "No, George and I have shared 6 girls." All this speculation. I've never given anything personal away, and I never will. People can't really delve into my past because that's before I was a pop star, but my present, there's so little that I have left of myself now that I'm going to keep it to myself. It's that simple. Michael's other half of Wham told El País in 2023, after the Netflix Wham documentary came out, that he knew Michael was gay in 1983, but advised him, along with the band's background singer, to hide it, especially since Michael was worried that it would hurt the band's image. No wonder people thought he was gay. I mean, have you seen the Wake Me Up Before You Go-Go music video? The world wouldn't know for certain that Michael was gay until he was entrapped by an undercover officer in a public restroom and arrested for a lewd act that he was performing in front of the officer's sight, forcing him to officially come out. Perhaps one of the most iconic moments to come with the AIDS and conservatism infected 80s was Queen's 1985 Live Aid performance. Freddie Mercury, like most queer artists at the time, was very close-lipped when it came to his sexuality. Queen's I Want to Break Free music video was subversive for Mercury, who was secretly queer, featuring all the members in drag as a parody of a popular British TV show. Queen's guitarist Brian May spoke about the video in 2012. All around the world, people laughed and they got the joke and they sort of understood it. I remember being on the promo tour in the Midwest of America and people's faces turning ashen and they would say, "No, we can't play this. We can't possibly play this. You know, it looks homosexual." 2 years after Live Aid, Mercury was officially diagnosed with AIDS. In 1991, he died from bronchial pneumonia resulting from the disease, one day after he publicly announced it to the world. The world speculated, his family didn't know, and his bandmates barely knew the truth. Mercury died after silently suffering with the illness for years, after a career of keeping a part of himself an open secret from the world. The world was just too ignorant to figure it out. Brian May spoke of Freddie Mercury's camp persona, saying, "In those days, it was the fashion to be kind of dandyish, and I suppose we had a hand in creating the fashion. There was this doubt in people's minds as to whether you might be gay or not. It was a convenient little place to be. Here's the thing. There were plenty of people who loved queer music because it was queer, but there were a lot more people who loved it in spite of it being queer. They may have thought that Elton John was a bit fruity, and they were homophobic to it in response, but they ignored it, since he and others were not overtly gay in their eyes. They may make fun of it, but it wasn't the biggest deal. It's not like they were actually sucking off guys in glory holes, right? On the other hand, there was an entire other group of people who genuinely didn't think that men who were actually gay, acting gay, meant that they were gay. They were literally ignorant to queer people in queer culture. They wouldn't have accused Nikki Sixx of being gay because they didn't associate men dressing in makeup for strictly a performance as gay. There was a very fine line of what made you gay and therefore worthy of hate, and what made you a man who just happened to be camp. The reality is that despite how popular queer music was at the time, and how iconic it has become, it took a while to catch on. And even then, it was still considered nonconformist, a new wave. Of course, every band and musician I discuss in this video isn't new wave in the sense of the exact definition, but they were still nonconformist to the yuppie Reaganists of the time, in either their music and or visual presentation. Tim Tiemann, a writer for The Daily Beast, told William Bragman of PBS when speaking about Wham. Wham, as Angus Walker described in his report there, were almost the harbingers, the heralds of Thatcherism himself. The group was very anti-Thatcher, famously anti-Thatcher, but their brand of pop and the kind of aspiration and the brightness of that pop was radical and revolutionary. On top of that, there were plenty of normie and bad songs to come out of the 80s, like we have our Ed Sheeran and Benson Boones of the world today, making easily marketable music that appeals to the capitalist-created masses. In the 80s, you had your Hall & Oates, Kool and the Gang, Cyndi Lauper, Rick Astley, and Starship. If you like any of those people, that's fine, but I think that their music can be classified as bland and mass appealing. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's not like Hall & Oates were pushing the boundaries of conformity and sexuality, which is kind of the topic for this video. The kind of people who listened to this mass appeal music were rich and uptight Reaganites. I mean, they certainly weren't going to turn on Like a Prayer, even if it was #1 on the charts. Lil Nas X's Call Me By Your Name may have been the #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, but Charlie Kirk was certainly not listening to it. Many things have changed since the 80s. Partially because of the internet, but also because of the change in the political landscape, people are more in their own cultural bubbles than ever before. Or bubbles that have no culture. Most of the people who had serious issues with new wave music at the time were rich or old, while the young working class largely consumed it as a fresh and exciting turn away from the establishment of the time. Moreover, you couldn't be that picky with what was on the radio or TV like you can today. Today we have perfectly curated social media feeds and constant on-demand music and TV streaming. The divide between people who like artists who are creating fresh music and visuals is even starker than it was then. Plus, people can share their disdain for something, Sam Smith did and have it go viral overnight. For outrage to reach the mainstream in the 80s, it would have had to be a bigger deal than just gossip in retirement homes, including the US Capitol. I have a question that I seriously want all of you to consider. If Kiss hit the scene today, would they become as popular as they did in the 80s? If Elton John was flamboyantly performing today like he was then, would he not receive immense backlash for being too pushy with his gay identity? It's not like the 80s were a good time for the LGBTQ community, or for any marginalized community. We've already covered how shit it was. But fortunately or unfortunately, the culture of the time allowed explorative queer and non-queer artists to become a part of the mainstream, something that is incredibly rare nowadays. That's not to say that all popular music today is bad, but I think we are seeing less of a mix of explorative artists nowadays than we once saw, likely partly due to our still very conservative culture. If you look at the charts now, most of the music is bland and boring. While the 80s had their fair share of bland and boring music, I genuinely don't believe that the artists that we look at now as doing these crazy things on stage and stuff like Kiss or so on, whatever, you could put anyone in there, I seriously don't think that they would become popular nowadays. I genuinely don't think they would reach the mainstream at all. Today, if a man did half of what male musicians did in the 80s, they would be called gay quicker than you could say Donald Trump sucked Bill Clinton off. One would like to think that the world has evolved past the closet culture of the 80s, and while we have made significant strides, we are quickly regressing. Not to mention the obvious fact that LGBTQ people from different parts of the world are still being violently persecuted, largely thanks to the violence of British colonialism and American imperialism. Not only that, but a lot of liberals are reluctant to accept the fact that this country has always been like this. We didn't suddenly become a communist queer utopia because of Barack Obama. While for a time it seemed that a pro-LGBTQ world specifically was quickly becoming the norm, the turnaround has been fast. We're not living through a crisis like AIDS, but the world is still unsafe for LGBTQ people. And with many culture wars still thriving, like fear-mongering around metal music and anti-queer sentiments, Popular music isn't as provocative anymore. LGBTQ people have become hyper-visible, which has been both a positive and a detriment. More people are more aware of our struggles and, in turn, what it means to be bisexual, transgender, aromantic, intersex, and so on. But knowledge does not equal understanding, and ignorance can still persist in the presence of knowledge. Hypervisibility means that people think that a man dressing or acting feminine is automatically gay, that anyone who deviates from the binary gender expression is automatically transgender. Whereas, also to the detriment of LGBTQ people, people in the 80s were mostly ignorant of LGBTQ issues, meaning they were less likely to do any of the aforementioned things. Hence why all of the queer and camp artists of the time could get away with being queer and or camp. We're still living through Reaganism and the consequences of it. Furthermore, we still exist alongside, with some of us greatly contributing to, American imperialism and hyperconsumption, as well as the American political system, and many other injustices that have fallen from the hands of our government. America is a country born and grown on injustice and oppression. It's only natural that its own citizens would also suffer from its backwards ideals. While Reagan may have made everything bad about this country 10 times worse, ruining the lives of billions for decades to follow, he couldn't stop Freddie Mercury from being a queen, or Sylvester and Jermaine from being black queer icons. And we can thank God that we live in a world where the song Like a Prayer exists. I obviously can't possibly cover every queer or camp artist from the 80s, so if you think I've missed someone important, please kindly comment about it down below. Kindly, okay? I also wasn't alive during this time, so if you were, please share your thoughts and kindly correct me if I said anything that you think is incorrect. I've had this video idea on my mind for a long time. I put a lot of time into it because I wanted to do it justice, so seriously, I thank you all so much for watching. Please like, comment on this video, fucking hype it, whatever the fuck that means. I know what it means, but like, I don't want to tell you guys to have to do that too. It's just another thing I have to fucking worry about. But I don't know, fucking hype the video, because this topic means a lot to me. I'm very passionate about it. So please support this video, interact with it, subscribe to my channel if you like my videos. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to support me even further, the link to my Patreon will be down below. That is the best way to directly financially support me. On that note, I'd like to give a shout out to my Patreon members who are part of my Alpha and Delta tiers. Thank you so much to Dallas Andrade, Lisbeth Ruiz, and Shula Cooper. Thank you so much for your support. It means so much to me. Thank you, truly. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much to all of my Patreon members. If you want to become a member, the link will be down below. I really hope you all enjoy this video, but more importantly, I really hope I see you in the next video. I just want to make sure that you continue to watch my videos, that you support me. Will you do that for me? All right, bye.